right, we're going to go ahead and get started if everyone's ready. We are so excited for today's presentation by Lee Linder, Practical Strategies for Behavioral Support. Lee Linder is a board-certified behavior analyst with specialties in behavioral gerontology and the behavioral presentations of medical diagnosis in people with IDRD. He works closely with organizations such as the National Task Group on Intellectual Disabilities and Dementia Practices, and received the 2024 American Academy of Developmental Medicine and Dentistry Excellence in IDD Journalism Award for contributions to Helen, the Journal of Human Exceptionality. Lee is the founder and CEO of Crescent Behavioral Health Services based in Columbia, South Carolina. Take it away, Lee.
Thank you, Carrie. When I write those bios, it feels less embarrassing. And then when I hear you read them out loud, I just kind of blush. I'm like, she's talking about the wrong guy. But I'm incredibly flattered to be here today. I am based in South Carolina. I was flipping through some of the names. I recognize some names. I am with Crescent Behavioral Health Services. I'm also have a second business that I founded called the Empathic Behavior Collective, where I do a lot of webinars and trainings around the country. I couldn't be more ecstatic that Becky and Carrie reached out to me, because this is the first time that I've ever had the opportunity to do any training or webinar-based training in South Carolina, which is where I live and where I work. So thank you for the opportunity. I'm super stoked to be here and excited to talk about the topic today. A few housekeeping things, as I always do. Just a very brief presentation notice. I will not be reading to anyone today, but the main point of this slide is I'm not being paid to be here. I am not, no companies are asking me to push their products or their medications. We may talk about some medications loosely today, but wanted to give that presentation notice. Don't know how much medical and health information we're going to get into today. This is very much in the space of applied and practical behavioral strategies. But in the event that we did, the part in blue is the most important. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a physician. Don't disregard anything from your medical health professionals based on something you heard today. My last housekeeping slide is I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, maybe 50, because I can get long-winded and verbose, particularly if you guys send me on a tangent. But after that, I'll make sure I save some room for Q&A, and I want to be very mindful of everyone's time because it is lunchtime on a Tuesday, and you're here giving me that time. I know that Carrie had a message in there about the using the chat box. The way that I have this set up, I can't actually see the chat box, but I do want as many questions as possible. If you've got anything that's a burning idea, please bring it up, or Carrie, if you want to facilitate the chat box, that can help guide the conversation over the next 45 minutes or so. So I do want this to be as interactive as possible, even though I recognize it's on a video call. But I'm going to hop right into the good stuff, so to speak. Today's conversation is not going to be in the space of me talking about specific behaviors, such as if a person's having suicidal ideations, here's the OIDD response to that behavior. We're not going to break down specific behaviors. When Carrie and Becky and I got together, what we really wanted was something that could drive home the idea that behavior strategies didn't have to be specific to a person and could also be taken from the presentation today and used when you walk into a home or walk into your day program or walk into a family's home this afternoon. So they're going to be very practical. And the other dynamic is that we're not looking at the reactive side of behavior. We're looking at prevention. How can we recognize common themes in behavioral presentations, and what are the intervention strategies that we could use prior to the onset of behavior? So I know a lot of us are familiar with the idea of the ABC model of behavior: antecedent, behavior, and consequence. Antecedent being the dynamics that increase the likelihood of problem behavior occurring. And for today, we are talking about the antecedents. What are the things that are happening prior to the onset of a behavior? And what are some of the common intervention strategies that I use both in my day-to-day work when I'm training our staff, but also when we're working beyond South Carolina and training other areas of specialty, such as nurses or working with physicians and neurologists? How are we looking at identifying behavior in a preventative fashion. And these are the three areas we're going to talk about today: the delay, denial, and termination, communication abilities, and power struggles. We'll take a relatively deep dive into these three, but I'm also approaching this from the standpoint that nobody here is brand new, and I'm going to try to meet you at a higher level so that you're not bored to tears. So let's go to the next slide and right into delay, denial, and termination. When I say delay, denial, and termination, those are three words that I use very frequently that make me feel good about my education and make me feel smart. However, the reality is they are just overly complex terms for really simple meanings. Delay meaning we are telling people to wait. Denial meaning we are telling people no. And termination being we are telling people to stop. And those three dynamics are things that lead to problem behaviors routinely. And when I say problem behaviors, some people get it like, well, Lee, not all behaviors are problems, and they're not. I'm talking about kind of the general idea of what we conceptualize problem behavior to be: verbal aggression, property destruction, such as banging on a wall or tearing up a piece of paper. Could be something as simple as that. Self-abuse, things that people are engaging in that we kind of all globally consider to be problem behaviors. But one thing that leads to an increased likelihood of those occurring are the dynamics of how we are navigating telling people to wait, telling people no, and telling people to stop. It drives people absolutely crazy if we are not navigating these necessary dynamics day to day. My background is primarily working in residential and day program settings, and I recognize that there's a tremendous number of instances throughout any day that us as staff and service providers have to do these things for the people we serve. But how we do it can prevent behaviors, and how we do it can also cause behaviors. My little picture here, and I do not know what movie this is from, but it's a visual prompt for me to tell you guys my DMV story. I've had the pleasure of going to the DMV twice in the last 30 days, which has been nothing short of misery. But there's a reason why the DMV is miserable for people. And I want, for those of us that have the ability to go back to the late 90s, if you will, of how our experiences of the DMV were. And in the late 90s, you would walk into the DMV, and even in the last 30 days is not that dissimilar. You would pull a number, and on that number, it would say something like J076. And then you would go sit down. And then the misery commenced. You would be sitting there and you'd be waiting, and you would have no idea how long you were going to have to wait there. And it would drive you crazy. And while you're waiting, you're sitting there going, there's got to be a better way for me to get this done. I realized the other day that you are not able to renew your driver's license online, that you actually have to go to the DMV and take their eye test. There was no alternative for me. I had to sit there. And then while I'm sitting there, particularly in the late 90s, there's nothing to do. You got the opportunity to watch whatever news program was on the TV, and they would give you those magazines that were so worn, the ink was smudged, and they were covered in dirt or grime or whatever it was. And it would drive you nuts because you didn't know how long you were going to wait. You didn't have anything to do while you were waiting, and you didn't have an alternative. And then it got worse when someone like Carrie would walk in and you're like, wait, Carrie pulled her number after me. Why is she at the desk before me? That's not fair. And then by the time you get to the desk, you got this, I guess it's a bear or a lion's experience of just being exasperated. You're upset, you're angry, and you're frustrated, and everything has come to a head. And then you display some level of behavior, such as possibly frustrating. You could be short with the person behind the desk. Maybe you're cursing at them. But using the example of the DMV of waiting, not having an alternative, and having nothing to do while you wait is exactly what we do to the individuals we serve every single day when we don't have the tactfulness to provide them things they need when we are forced to tell them no, or when we need to ask them to wait, or we need them to stop engaging in a specific activity or behavior. I've kind of given you a couple of hints already, but when the art of saying no requires three things, potentially four, but three for sure. You have to give people an alternative to the request or activity that you were telling them they can't currently engage in. I remember when I was a residential coordinator working in a CRCF, there was a woman that would come in every afternoon when the staff were cooking dinner, and she would say, "What's for dinner? I'm hungry." And there was a staff there. They're no longer working there, for better or worse. But every afternoon, that staff would say, "Go sit down. I'm cooking. I'll let you know when it's ready." Well, when that lady was coming in and asking what was for dinner and saying she was hungry, the intervention of "go sit down" wasn't giving her an alternative. There was no idea of what she could have instead of the request, because the intervention didn't match what she was asking for. So had the staff said, "Hey, I'm cooking dinner, the chicken, the rice, and the broccoli is going to be ready in a little while because that's what we're having for dinner, but here's half a peanut butter sandwich, or a couple of cookies, or a half a banana," that would be an alternative to her request of or statement of "what are we having for dinner?" and "I'm hungry." So that would be one thing that we could have provided the individual in that situation that would decrease the likelihood of problem behavior. The other dynamic is a preferred activity. When I went to the DMV the other day for the second time, I learned I need to take my iPad with me because I need something to do. It was 9 o'clock on a Monday morning and I had work to do. So I went in there and had my iPad so I could send some emails. Well, I had an activity to do while I waited. To go back to the example of the food and dinner, a preferred activity could be something where you're redirecting them, if you will, to go play a video game, watch TV, potentially could be an intervention, or something more activity based, such as, "Would you mind helping me set the table?" Or in some scenarios, inviting them to help prepare the meal, something to do while they're waiting for the request of "I'm hungry, I'm ready to eat." Offering people recognizing that these are part of the offerings that we have to provide people when we're telling them to wait or telling them no or telling them to stop can help be preventative measures of decreasing possible problem behavior. The third dynamic is a time frame. And this is really one of the more important components of navigating these necessary components of denying and terminating and delaying access to activities or requests, is when are they going to get it? I see this so frequently where we tell people, "You'll get it when I'm done," or "You'll get it in 30 minutes. Well, some of our folks don't really understand time. Or I was with an individual the other day in his room, and I needed him to wait for me to go do something. And I was like, "Can you give me 15 minutes? Well, I looked around and he didn't have a clock in his room. He used his TV, which wasn't working. He used the TV guide as his clock, but his TV was broken. So he didn't even have a clock to look at. But we have to find a way to give people an understanding of when they're going to get the request or get the activity that they're looking for. But if they don't understand time, the way that we can do that is through event-based time stamping, is the fancy word for it. For better or worse, the individuals that we work with are on highly regimented schedules, and they recognize activities throughout their day that happen every day. Medication pass is a really obvious one. Eating, breakfast, lunch, and dinner with snacks intermixed in there in the residential and day program settings. We can use these event-based timestamps to help guide people through time. So if they're asking to go out on an activity, we're going on an activity after you get your afternoon meds, or after dinner, we're going to go out to eat. I've also used one such as Drew Carey. When Drew Carey goes off from Price is Right, then we're going to eat. I don't know how many times I've watched Drew Carey sitting in a home, but he seems quite popular with our folks. And using those time frames to help navigate when we need to delay, deny, or terminate various requests are incredibly important. And these are tangible items that we could conceptualize to take into our work today of how do we say this? And we've done all of this without telling anybody no. The fourth component that could be beneficial to some folks is robust explanations of why it's happening. Some folks that doesn't necessarily move the needle, but sometimes it's, hey, I need you to give me a few minutes because in order for me to help you, I have to go talk to somebody else. And that was the scenario with the gentleman with the broken TV. Giving them some of that robust explanation can also help. If we find ourselves in situations where we just say no and walk away, that is a good predictor that there's an increased likelihood of problem behavior. The inverse of this also holds true. And this is where I kind of get on a very quick soapbox. Everything we've talked about so far is the idea of how we are providing information to an individual when we need them to either stop, wait, or that they can't do it. However, as a global service provider network, we do an incredibly poor job of allowing the residents and the people we serve to tell us to wait, tell us no, or tell us to stop. Because when they tell us that, behaviorally, we perceive that to be non-compliance. I spend a tremendous amount of my day telling people, I don't want to do that, or I'll do it later, or quit, leave me alone, I'm over this. We have to afford the people that we work with the same opportunity. Whether they are someone that needs max assist to transfer from a bed to a wheelchair using a Hoyer lift, that is a potential example of someone who may want you to stop doing something because it hurts. Their arm's been pinched when they've rolled over, or they're uncomfortable in the Hoyer lift transferring back to their bedroom because it's cold and they're wet from the shower. They need to have the ability and the trust that when they ask us to wait, ask us to stop, or tell us no, that they have the same ability. When we don't afford them the ability to do that, it increases the likelihood of problem behaviors. Okay. So moving right along into the next section, I know I'm going to kind of like put these into 3 sections and we can blend it all together at the end through questions if we need to, is the idea of understanding communication. I'm a big proponent of this, and it sounds incredibly simple, and it is, that we have to understand communication in order to decrease problem behavior and also prevent it. But what I want to do for about 5 or 10 minutes is kind of dissect, if you will, what communication is when I think of it from a behavioral standpoint. And you'll see 2 boxes here. One's expressive, one's receptive. And I think understanding what communication is for the individuals we serve in these 2 domains is incredibly important. Expressive communication is going to be the output. It's what a person says or does that communicates their thoughts or feelings. When you think about verbal communication, speaking is actually a behavior. If you go back and get real nerdy about behavioral analysis started through the analysis of verbal behavior and how people communicate and talk. But it's the output of it. What is the person saying or doing that lets them communicate how they feel? Receptive communication is going to be how they process that, how they understand what they're seeing and hearing. It also goes into social cues. Those definitions are pretty simple to understand, but I think where we have room to improve understanding communication is that we make a mistake sometimes that assuming that someone's expressive communication skills are the same as their receptive communication skills. And when we do this, we're going to have lapses in communication. And I apologize for the sirens in the background if you can hear that. Working from my home office, and someone needs an ambulance. But when these don't match, we can have an increased likelihood of problem behavior. If an individual speaks in a very robust, fluent dynamic, we make the assumption sometimes that their receptive ability is the same. What's happening today in this setting with this webinar is I'm giving all of you a tremendous amount of verbal communication that is completely reliant upon your ability to understand the words I'm saying, but also process them quickly and comprehend them quickly as I'm moving through the webinar. But if your receptive communication skills were not great and I was giving you this quantity of information, I may have lost you after the first or second slide. Where we see this happen with our day-to-day work is when we're giving people task demands or asking them to do things where we're giving them large quantities of information, but they're only understanding a few parts of it. And where we see that behaviorally is the person's not completing tasks fully. They may be completing the task wrong. They may not even complete the task because they don't understand all of the parts. And that's because we're failing to recognize that their receptive communication skills are not matching the expressive ones. And the inverse of this is also true. Individuals that are nonverbal can routinely be perceived as not having high levels of receptive communication. And this is not always true. We have to recognize what the individual's communication skills are in these dynamics and adapt our interactions with them accordingly. One of the other important dynamics that we need to attune to in regards to understanding communication better is in the space of social cues. And I know everyone's mind kind of quickly turns towards individuals with autism and that dynamic, but I think it goes beyond just that specific diagnosis. And all the individuals that we serve is understanding how social cues impact the behavioral presentations. If Becky were to sit here and say, oh my God, Lee's been talking for 20 minutes. I made the biggest mistake I've ever made. We're done with this. Everyone can leave early, and I'll promise they'll never invite him back. What theoretically is preventing Becky from doing that is social cues, the professional decorum that she's going to ensure, okay, even if this is not valuable information, we're still going to let him finish and be nice. But those social cues are guiding that. And if we are not allowing or accounting for the fact that our folks don't always understand the social cues or not necessarily respectful of them, how does that impact their understanding of the environment, but also their behavioral response to it? So I guess in summation, understanding communication in my world, when I'm looking at it, is trying to delineate not just how a person speaks or how they communicate, but where is their functioning capacity and abilities in these two domains. And from a intervention perspective, this is what we put in a lot of our behavioral plans. And I get asked sometimes by folks that actually read our behavioral plans, they'll go, Lee, this is in the same plan as Bob's. And you're going, yes, you're exactly right. It's in the same plan as Bob's because it impacts every single person we see. This communication dynamic is almost universal in understanding behavior, in my opinion. And it's really quite simple in some respects, but there can be some really impactful components to this. The first one is eye contact. In talking to people where they can actually see you. So much of communication goes beyond verbal communication, nonverbal communication. We talked about the social cues. One of the things I see with some regularity when I'm in a house is staff are providing verbal direction from a different room. So they may be in the kitchen and ask someone to do something that's in the den. Well, we just kind of broke down the idea of receptive communication and expressive in those different domains of verbal and nonverbal and social cues. If we're talking to people from different rooms and they need those additional areas of communication for context and comprehension, talking to them when we're not in front of them does not allow them to have all of the available communication resources, if you will. It's much more difficult, but another example of it could be when we're on vans and transporting, where individuals are in the back and the staff are driving. Obviously, there's not a great alternative to that, but that's an example of where we're kind of only giving the person one part of the totality of communication when we're only talking to them verbally. So the idea of eye contact or being in close proximity to them is an effective strategy. Calm tone. This is massive. The number of times that the tone that we're using, our approach to care in regards to the onset of behavioral issues, but also in crisis management situations, the tone and the approach is critically important. If I were to say to Carrie, hey, Carrie, let's go to Wendy's this afternoon. The weather's supposed to be warmer. We can go to the park. We can get an ice cream and we can hang out. You've been doing really good behaviorally lately. We haven't had any issues. You've done great at work. That's great. That's a lot different than if I go, damn it, Carrie, today we got to go on an activity, get in the van so we can get this done, get back. I got to give you your meds by 5 and I got to give you a bath too. Those are two different dynamics. The tone there is markedly different, but the outcome's same. Carrie may still get ice cream, but the tone is markedly different. That's an important dynamic with the communication. Our folks are very adept, regardless of their skill sets, their diagnosis. They're incredibly adept to understanding tone, nonverbal cues. They know when we're being mean. They know when we're being rude or dismissive. They're very perceptive. So that's an important part of the communication dynamic. Number 3, the 1 or 2 sentence exchanges. This can be a little difficult to put into practice because it doesn't necessarily match the normal cadence and flow of conversations, but it does really hone in on the dynamic of receptive communication. If we recognize that someone doesn't have a robust receptive communication skill set, we need to sometimes give them less information. And that can be in these short 1 to 2 sentence exchanges. It becomes very idiosyncratic to the individual, how you interact with them. Some people do this very naturally. Some folks do it, need a little more work and practice with how to tailor their conversations to interacting with the individuals based on their communication needs. The number 4 and number 5 are my favorite ones in regards to communication strategies, and it's because it's where I get the most information from a behavioral perspective. We can test people's comprehension very easily and very quickly. Just ask them to repeat back what you said. Hey guys, I just talked for 25 minutes on these 4 slides. Give me some feedback on what the key points were. And I would very quickly be able to tell whether or not any of you were getting the information, but also was I presenting it in a way that was highlighting the key points. Well, we can do the same thing with folks when we're talking to them about, well, what are we doing today? Well, what's next? Asking them to repeat back to us what we've said and what the activity schedule would be in this example, or if we need them to complete task demands or we're asking them to go do certain things. Okay, so what are we doing? What's the plan? You will get immediate information, immediate feedback of whether or not you have been able to successfully convey to that person what it is that you need or want for them just by asking them to repeat it back to you. And again, I keep using this term, the inverse is also true. And I keep saying that in the space, we have to use the inverse in the space of how are we recognizing the individual's experience? How are they, what's their role in our interaction with them? We also need to repeat back to them what they said so that we can test our own comprehension of what their want or need is. Am I understanding you correctly? Is this what you need? If I do this, is it going to give you what you want or need? It's not just a matter of us understanding or them understanding our task demands. It's also us understanding them. And that's a critical component of communication, is that both parties have to be understanding each other. And a simple and effective way of doing that is just repeating it back. somewhat of a tangent here. The idea of repeating stuff back to people is a really effective strategy in informal counseling, where if someone's having a really bad day, say back to them what they're saying is wrong or what's bothering them, and particularly with emotional based behaviors, letting them hear their own words so that they can hear them back, but also ensuring that we understand what the problem is. So this dynamic I mentioned crisis management a second ago. This idea of the back and forth of repeating is something that I use in crisis management, particularly if there's an emotional component to it, where talking about it can be cathartic at times, but repeating back and forth, that's somewhat of a counseling strategy. So in the last 15 minutes or maybe 10 minutes or so, one of my favorite topics to talk about is punishment, which is not today's topic. But if I were ever to be invited back again, I would ask Becky and Carrie to let me talk about punishment. But we're going to touch on that through the idea of power struggles. I think we all know what power struggles are. The definition of them is pretty loose, but it's the idea that I want my will to be the one that is exercised. You need to do what I want. And if you don't want to do that, we're going to get in a struggle there. Where I see power struggles come in regards to behavior is the idea that two things: meaningless rules or arbitrary rules, and a me first attitude. I'll put some quotes in here that I hear, that I've heard over the years, in working in homes and day programs, where these meaningless rules can drive a lot of behaviors. If we find ourselves in a situation where our behavioral intervention or our approach to care is rooted in an idea of because I said so, you're probably going to be going down the line of a power struggle. I hear with a fair amount of frequency, well, that's just the rule. That's how I was trained. That's what we got to do. That is going to lead towards a power struggle because there's no real reason for it, and you're going to get a clash of wills there. This is where I'm going to get into the punishment dynamic, where I hear all the time, well, these folks just need consequences. They can't do that. If we let them do that, then everyone's going to do it. Well, what we're getting at in that space is the idea of punishment. And I know there's a lot of folks out there that may be going, well, I don't use punishment. You do. We all do it. We use punishment all the time. It's just not a particularly effective behavioral strategy when it's not specific to the individual and it's not specific to the function of the behavior, which is getting a little off the scope of today's conversation. But we have to recognize that if we are using punishment, which the most common form is removing items from a person, such as, you're not going out on Friday for dinner, or we're going to take away your Xbox 360 or your video game console. When we start removing items from people in a punishment perspective, you are immediately creating a power struggle. Someone's will is against someone else's will, and that's a power struggle. So we have to be very careful of recognizing when we are creating these. Power struggles happen all the time with the individuals we serve, and rarely do we as the service providers win. We almost always lose. Again, that's how we've always done it. Similar to that's the rule. One of my pet peeves is when I walk into a residential setting and I hear someone go, "Kitchen's closed." I've never lived in my house where the kitchen was closed. This is an immediate power struggle where we are putting in arbitrary rules where you only get to eat at certain times a day, or you're only allowed in there when I am cooked or after I've cooked for a meal. And I understand that there's outliers to this based on diagnosis, such as Prader-Willi syndrome. There could be instances where someone doesn't need to be around sharp objects. There could be individuals who eat raw food or health and safety risk. I recognize that. But as a general conversation, the idea of arbitrary rules create massive amounts of power struggles. I see it in day programs where people go, you can't, this is your area, you can't walk outside of this. Well, that's an arbitrary rule. If the expectation is we want people to sit down for 6 to 8 hours a day, that's probably a unreasonable thing to ask of them. And finding ways for them to walk around and move around would be a better behavioral intervention as opposed to this arbitrary dynamic that you have to sit down all day. So those meaningless rules really drive some of the power struggle dynamics that we see. And then this me first attitude, where when we put our role as service providers first, as opposed to the care of the individual, where my job is to pass these meds, get the food on the table, and get the individuals bathed. And if I do it by 8 o'clock, that means by 11 o'clock, from 8 to 11, my shift's going to be a little easier. If that's the lens through which we're looking at it, that's a me first attitude, and that's creating arbitrary schedules, arbitrary rules that can increase the likelihood of problem behavior. It's better for me if I do it this way. This one was one that I came across the other day, and it said, I'm not coming to work to get cursed at. And I just kind of wanted to tell the guy, well, you probably picked a bad job. I used a curse word, but in my example with Carrie a few minutes ago, some of you may have been like, oh my God, like he's not following the social norms of professional decorum and he cursed. This is part of what we deal with every day. People use words we don't want them to use. But the idea that I'm not coming to work to get cursed at is a me first attitude that very quickly leads to the idea of they need consequences and we can't let them do that. Those mentalities and approaches and philosophies, although it seems outside the scope of behavioral analysis and behavioral interventions, these are common factors that present behavioral, that increase likelihood of problem behavior and present as problem behaviors. And then one of my all-time favorites is, you expect me to wait on them like a waitress or a waiter? And my answer is, yes, I do. Because the number one thing that prevents problem behavior with the individuals we work with is the anticipation of need. And that's a hospitality principle. When I was much younger and going through school and first working in this field, I supplemented my income through working in restaurants. And I learned pretty quickly that if I worked in fine dining restaurants, the tips were higher. But if you wanted to work in fine dining restaurants and get good tips, you had to anticipate the person's need before they ever asked for it. And if we can do that with the individuals we serve and anticipate what they need, we can eliminate some of these power struggles. We can eliminate some of the friction that's caused when they aren't getting access to what they need or what they want. So if we know they need it, let's just give it to them in advance. That's a dynamic and an idea that I try to weave into some of our behavioral interventions is, if we know that the person needs this, let's give it to them before they have to ask. And the way that they ask most commonly, if they're not doing it appropriately, is through problem behavior. So yes, I do expect you to wait on them. And from a servant dynamic, we are serving these individuals, and part of that is recognizing and anticipating their need. And then I think this is my last slide, and given I'm talking so fast, I'm going to end a few minutes early. And my, I guess, GIF over here is my thank you to Carrie and Becky, who are both dog people. So I picked this one for them. But the best intervention in regards to power struggles is don't pick up the rope. In order for there to be a power struggle, two people have to be pulling. This is one of the hardest things for me to impart to, if from a behavioral perspective, is the idea that we can just drop the rope. We don't have to argue. We don't have to engage in it. This box over here says, let it go. It's as simple as that. Let the rope go. Let the issue go. When I say disengage, I do not mean leaving somebody alone. I do not mean ignoring somebody. I mean stepping away and saying, Becky, when you feel better and you're not as upset or if you need a minute to calm down and relax,